Okay, I'm here with Dr. Chris Watkins you're from Monash University, aren't you, Chris? Monash.
That's right. Yeah.
Monash, very fine university down here in the heart of Melbourne, where undoubtedly cultural Marxism has definitely taken root. And as a university professor, I'm sure you are a strenuous and energetic advocate for cultural Marxism because, I figure that's what all Monash. Sorry, my mistake. I'm thinking of La Trobe University. I'm thinking of La Trobe. Sorry, my mistake. My mistake. You're at Monash. But Chris, can you just tell us something about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to be here with you, Mike. Good to chat. I am a Yorkshireman, born and bred. Grew up in Yorkshire until about 18 years old. Went down south to university, where I met my wife, who's an Australian, the wonderful Alison, and we came over here in 2011. I'm a philosopher. I've written books on atheism and what is a human being, and French philosophy, more sort of generally. And recently I've had a go at writing a Christian book, which is called Biblical Critical Theory, which I think is the reason that you want to have a chat with me today.
Oh, well, there's so many reasons to chat with you. I think you taught my daughter French, if I remember correctly.
Well, there you go.
Yeah,
I'm sure she was a stellar student.
Yeah, oh yeah, well, I hope so. I hope so. Well, she loved French and literature. But I mean, if we can go back to just a previous work, you've also written on Derrida, or as Jordan Peterson calls him, that joker, Derrida. So that's my Canadian accent. Is Derrida really the big scary monster that everybody raves about?
No. Um, I think with people like Derrida, um, it's easy to get sort of swept up in the hype, and it's easy to get so scared by what you think they might be saying, perhaps, that you sort of impute to them all sort of, use them as a cultural dustbin and throw into them everything that you think is wrong with the world. And neither of those are really true. I think a helpful way to read people like Derrida is to try and, in the first instance, just get inside their skin, see the world as they trying to see it, and see why they like what they like and why they're wary of what they're wary of. And once you can sort of feel the world from their point of view, that then you're in a position to step outside and say, well, what do I make of that, from my perspective? And I think when you do that, you see that, Derrida is seeking for ways to talk about things like justice that he thinks are really, really important, especially after the Second World War, which is, the context in which all that generation of French thinkers were formed. How do we talk about justice after the Holocaust? But without God in the picture, and it's really, really hard. And he tries really hard to square those sort of circles with varying degrees of success. And I think when you look at him that way, he's neither a big scary evil monster, nor as I've heard other people say, some sort of pathetic terrorist who's just trying to bring down the edifice of thought without any sort of integrity. It's rare that caricatures like that are adequate, isn't it, to people who have gained as much credibility as Derrida has.
Oh, fair enough. Well, that's good to know. So people want to know more about Derrida, they can read your book on Derrida. But we live in an age where philosophy is sometimes regarded as a threatening thing, and it seems like the world has gone sane over critical theory, things like critical race theory. In fact, the Australian Senate even passed a motion, condemning or censuring the teaching of critical race theory. So what is critical theory and critical race theory, and why is it such a big deal in certain places, like in America on Twitter, and why is the Senate passing motions against it in Australia?
Let's take a bit of a run up at that question. I think there are lots of different senses of critical theory, and they get narrower as you go along. So there's a broad sense, which I think is the place where you've got to start if you want to try and understand these things adequately, which is that it's a way of looking at the world that makes certain things visible and certain things valuable to you. So we all look out in the world, and certain things leap out to us. and different things leap out to different people, depending on your background and your sensitivities and what you think is important out there in the world. And, different people can experience the same situation or the same event, and, they can see different things in it and see different importance in different parts of it. So it is most basic sort of vanilla level. That's what a critical theory is doing for people. It's making certain things in the world stand out, and it's showing people what things in the world are to be valued positively and desired, and what things in the world are to be condemned. And at that really, really basic level, we all do that. Like, there's too much information assaulting our senses every day to take account of everything. We've all got filters, and so we all do that. And then there's a narrower sense of critical theory, where critical is understood in the sort of Enlightenment sense of critiquing the limits of knowledge. And, there you've got all the different thinkers that come after Kant. You've got your Foucaults, your Derridas, your postmodern people. That's a sort of a sense of critical theory. That was the first sense of critical theory that I sort of came up against. And then you tighten it even further, and you've got what's called the Frankfurt School critical theory, which is Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno, these sort of broadly Marxist, often strangely Marxist thinkers that wanted to, and this is, going back to that term you used in the intro a moment ago, this idea of cultural Marxism, that's where this comes from. And then you tighten it up a little bit further, and you've got these ideas that are, doing the rounds at the moment. For example, critical race theory that began with a guy called Derek Bell at Harvard in the last few decades, where he's trying to take some of these ideas and add in others, and trying to understand race relations and I guess you could call it raciality in society in a new way, and in particular ways that we can go into if you want. The question of why it's so hot at the moment, I think, is more complex than we often think. So the dynamics of the culture wars obviously play into this, and the way in which public discourse is becoming increasingly polarized, and certain terms and movements are used as shibboleths within the culture wars to sort of, signify in dog whistle type ways one's allegiances. And there's a lot of that going on. So there's a lot of froth, and there's a lot of use of terms like critical race theory in order to signal things other than the details of critical race theory. Broadly speaking, my understanding, and I'm mainly coming at it through Derek Bell, and he's by far not the only theorist of critical race theory, and others will say different things. It's an idea that in modern Western society, and particularly in the United States, where this theory has really grown up and taken hold, that the disadvantage of Black men and women in society is not just ephemeral, and it can't go away quickly. It is fundamentally baked into the way in which Western society works. And therefore, you can't just appeal to white people to try a little bit harder and expect race relations to fix themselves in society. There needs to be some fundamental, basic overturning of social norms, because disadvantage to Black people and other minorities is so deep in society that you can't just sort of brush it away quickly. That would be a sort of a thumbnail sketch, and therefore, the sort of idea that you've seen recently of defund the police will be part of that sense. You can't just cosmetically deal with this issue. There needs to be some huge fundamental overturning of society in order to address these deep problems of racial inequality.
Yeah, I mean, that was my understanding. A critical race theory asked the question, like, if a white guy and a black guy both commit the same crime with no priors, why does the black guy get 18 months in prison and the white guy only get 3 months in prison? And why does it take, when they both get out of prison, why does the white guy get a job after like 6 months, but then the black guy still struggling to get a job after 3 years? I mean, there's no official law trying to make that happen. It just seems to be these aggregate inequalities or differences that seem to emerge because of the cultural landscape. And critical race theory asks, why does that happen? I mean, that's my understanding. But then
Yeah, and the answer that it, sorry, Mike, go on.
you finish. You
No, I was
finish.
just going to say the answer that it would give is it's not simply a case of, you know, white people trying to be nasty. That there are fundamental structural, deep structural sort of tendencies within society that make equality impossible. And that's what he's dealing with. The whole structure of society he's dealing with.
Yeah. But my fear is we also have some what I would call CRT televangelists who are using CRT as a platform to say some really kind of insane, what I regard as somewhat insane stuff, like white parents should not adopt black children because that's colonizing black children with white culture. And if you love your white parents, then you've internalized your own racism. It's stuff like that I just find a little bit weird. I don't know how to explain it, but it seems to be taking it and applying it to in a very peculiar direction. So I've tended to discriminate between what I call the robust and authentic, you know, CRT practitioners from what I would call the CRT televangelists who seem to do the rounds. I know, am I wild off base there?
Look, I think in any sort of social movement or tendency, you're going to get a range of opinion, aren't you? I mean, look at Christianity. You know, it's hardly the case that all Christians, you know, are sort of completely aligned on everything. And you know, as these movements sort of grow and you get differences within them, people are going to say different things. So it's the question of granularity, isn't it? Like terms like critical race theory and, you know, Christianity or Protestant Christianity or evangelical Christianity are sort of useful and we sort of need them to get by, but they got their limits as well. And there comes a point when you need to start making distinctions if you're going to try and characterize individuals. That's why I think it's key to deal with particular thinkers as opposed to movements. So I wrote a book on Derrida, for example, and then different one on Foucault, rather than writing a book on postmodernism. And I try and understand critical race theory primarily through Derek Bell, because as soon as you start trying to summarize these broad movements, like what do you want to say about Christianity that all Christians are going to say, yep, that's me? It gets pretty tricky pretty quickly. And you start having to make some broad generalizations that a lot of people are going to say, you know, you've lost me. That's not me anymore. So I think approaching it through individuals is a helpful way not to fall into that trap.
Okay. So it allows you to follow one particular intellectual path rather than every different sort of spot fire that's been lit by this movement.
Yeah. And it allows you to let people explain things in their own terms. Like, you know, Derrida and Foucault really disagree quite profoundly on a number of important issues. And if you're trying to give some sort of synthesis of both of their positions, you're going to end up speaking a language that neither of them would want to own. And, you know, sometimes that's helpful and necessary, but a lot of the time that just leaves you sort of speaking in the void, and nobody is going to say, yes, you are speaking about me. You understand the way that I think, because it's too sort of, it's up at 30,000 feet. And it's not actually engaging with what any particular person is saying on the ground.
Okay, fair enough. Now, what's interesting about you, you're not by any means repudiating the whole concept of critical theory, you know, pointing things that stand out and appeal to us and things that are wrong with the world and our perception. You've written a book called Biblical Critical Theory, which I think could just as well be called Augustinian critical theory, since you're, you know, immensely influenced by Augustine, his volume, you know, The City of God. Some people will hear the critical theory, and in light of all those cultural wars and debates, think, how could there possibly be a Christian, let alone a biblical version of critical theory? It's like Christian Marxism, kind of, or you know, or Christian, you know, heresy, or, you know, whatever it is. So what is biblical critical theory? What are you trying to do in this book, Chris?
Okay. Let me give a two-part answer, because I think there's the answer to what am I trying to do in the book, and there's the what is the title all about, and why call it biblical critical theory. So the aim of the book is sort of starting from an intuition that grew on me really as an undergraduate and just got I guess, stronger and stronger over the years, which is that, you know, you look at all these philosophers and they're all making certain things in the world visible and they're all making certain things in the world valuable. They're saying, look at it this way, this is to be praised, this is to be condemned. And you come to the Bible and you read it and you see that the Bible is also doing that. Like, it's doing more than that, but it is also doing that. Like, it draws your attention to things in the world, like, you know, the widows and the orphans, or the glory of God in creation, for example, that you might not otherwise see. It says, pay attention to this, notice this. And it shows some things in the world as valuable. You know, again, the glory of God is something you might never think of as being valuable if you hadn't read the Bible. And say, okay, wow, that's really, really valuable and important. So the Bible is doing that similar sort of thing. And so what would it look like? I guess the one of the premises of the book is to bring the Bible into that conversation. You know, all these different critical theories saying, this is what's important in the world, look at this, value this. And what would it look like to bring the Bible alongside and say, well, let's give the Bible a seat at that table and get that conversation going between those different ways of looking at the world. The question of the title is itself Augustinian, I think, because you're right, you know, biblical critical theory could come over as quite needlessly provocative. But I'm trying to do what Augustine is doing in the City of God, which is he starts the City of God in its original Latin with the word gloriosissima, which is like most glorious. He says, most glorious is the City of God. And you think, okay, well, that's fine. You know, you've got to start somewhere. But the more you think about it, the more provocative it comes over, because glory is Rome's sort of self-identifying value. You know, Rome is glorious because it crushes all its enemies and it wins all its battles, and its army is the biggest and the most brutal one, and it brings all the tribute back to Rome, and that's glory. And so, you know, in the way that you can do in Latin, Augustine shifts his sentence order around, and he starts the very first word, the very first sentence of the City of God with this word that anyone in the Roman world is going to immediately associate with Rome. And he says, most glorious is the City of God. And you think, well, hold on, what are you doing? That's why are you being so provocative? Like, give yourself chance to sort of define glory in biblical terms and say, this is not Rome, and I'm not, you know, assuming that this is the same. No, he doesn't do any of that. He goes straight in. He claims this language that Rome uses to define itself and says, actually, if you want real glory, you Romans who think you know everything about glory, you need to look at the City of God, because that is the most glorious city. And he hits that note right from the beginning. And so one thing that I'm trying to do with the title Biblical Critical Theory is to do a similar thing in relation to, you know, to this idea of critical theory that's current in society at the moment, and to say that the Bible is providing and, you know, I go into detail about this in particular ways that the Bible is doing this in the book. He's providing a particularly trenchant, incisive, supple, and fresh critical perspective on society that actually fulfills many of the aspirations of the, you know, other critical theories, post-Kantian critical theories, in the same way that Augustine is saying that the City of God fulfills the aspirations of Rome for glory. And I just have one more word on that, Mike, because I can imagine questions that are coming up in people's minds as I'm saying that. And I think one question that people may well have at this point is, whoa, you're saying the Bible fulfills the values and the aspirations of critical theory, but surely there isn't there an antithesis? Like, you know, the things that critical theory wants are not obviously biblical through and through. And my short answer to that is yes, but what Augustine is doing, I think, is he's giving us a pattern for cultural critique that goes hard on antithesis, but also goes all out on fulfillment. And I think that's his brilliance. That's the main reason that I'm using him as a model here. And the main reason I would just invite everyone to just go and read The City of God. You know, get half a year's leave, because it's a huge book and it's going to take you ages, but go and read The City of God. Because he's doing what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 1. You know, where he says, God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. And he says, but the foolishness of the cross is wiser than human wisdom. And I think what Paul is doing in that passage is he's hammering the antithesis between Greek wisdom and the Jewish demand for signs and power, and God on the one hand. He talks about God's foolishness in comparison to Greek wisdom. So he's all out on the antithesis. But he's also showing a couple of verses later in that passage that the wisdom of Christ, as he calls it, fulfills Greek wisdom. And that if the Greeks are really serious about this wisdom that they say they're looking for, they need to come to the cross, which is the last place that they would ever think of looking for. It's foolishness to them, but it's actually God's wisdom. And so he's giving you a pattern for how you can hold antithesis and fulfillment together. And I think Augustine takes that on. I don't know whether he gets it from 1 Corinthians 1 or whether he's just sort of in the air of his bibline blood, to use that term that's used of John Bunyan. But I think that's what he's doing in the City of God. So he doesn't compromise on antithesis. Like, he's not saying Roman glory is just a weak version of the glory of the City of God. He's strong on the antithesis, but he's also strong on the fulfillment. And that's the pattern of cultural critique that I think is really, really helpful today. Because you've got if you look at the landscape, sorry, Mike, I know this is long answer, I'm coming to an end now. If you look at the landscape, this is my last sentence, of Christian cultural critique, you sort of got your antithesis people and you've got your fulfillment people. And we operate on a spectrum sometimes between the two. And, the more antithetical you get, the less you see the Bible as a fulfillment of culture, and vice versa. And I just think that's such a tragedy. And Augustine and Paul show you how you can be 100% for antithesis between the Bible and culture and 100% for fulfillment at the same time.
So in terms of sort of a relationship to culture, I mean, culture is something you do talk about a fair bit in the book. We talk about, what is culture? So there is a sense in which there is a kind of Christ against culture. But is there a kind of almost I'm using the right word here, Niebuhrian view of Christ as the highest ideal of culture, or culture, finding its telos in Christ? Is it kind of a bit, and because we often think of different relationships to culture, and I think Don Carson gives like about 5 different options, against culture, in, through, by, or whatever it is. Are you saying that there's it's those multiple choice questions where you can pick 2? So you're saying we get to pick 2. It's not just A, B, or C, or D. You can have A and B in this one. There's an antithesis where you got the William Wilberforce, critiquing the culture of the day. But then you've got trying to take the culture's highest ideals and show how they find expression, attainment, fulfillment, and a climax in Christ. I don't know who I could name that second option after, but so that explains kind of in my understanding what you're doing.
I think that's what Paul's doing in 1 Corinthians 1. Niebuhr calls it Christ the transformer of culture, doesn't he? And I think so Paul is heavy on antithesis, which will be Christ against culture at that point, and he's heavy on this Christ transformer of culture. Carson sort of paints on the canvas of the biblical plot, doesn't he? And he says, you've got to take into account all the significant moments of the biblical storyline. And these 5 Niebuhrian categories are going to wax and wane in importance at different moments of the biblical plot. So I think Carson's got quite a nuanced way of passing out these different categories, which is really helpful because it gets over this hump of thinking I've got to plant my flag on one of these 5. I've either got to be a Christ against culture person, or I've got to be a Christ the transformative culture person. And Niebuhr, I think, to his credit, doesn't say that. He says, that there's a complexity to them, and Carson is bringing that out more fully. But if you wanted to do the whole sort of Christ and culture piece, I think you'd need to bring the biblical plot line in and say there's no one sort of balance of these different biblical these different paradigms of Christ and culture that's going to serve you well through creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. That there's a complexity of different emphases at different moments in the biblical plot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I once met a uniting church minister, which is like the American version would be like, United Methodist or United Reformed, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, he said, culture is the devil's whore. He says, culture is the attempt to create meaning and value without recourse to God. And Christ stands over culture and he condemns it, and yet he's gracious enough to come to us through it. That I was quite shocked by that way of framing it, particularly from a Uniting Church minister. But I mean, that's sort of the big antithetical of way of putting it. I want to go into something you say in your book that I found quite striking, and I'll need you to kind of unpack what you mean by that. You say, and this is on page 48 of the book, to explain the gospel to our culture in the culture's own terms and within its own stories is to domesticate its strangeness, to shave off its sharp corners and make it fit. It is to lose the gospel and fail to serve the culture, which then leads to a kind of, I think, an explanatory note in New Begin. Okay, can you explain what you mean by that? Because that sounds very much like there's Christ and culture and never the twain shall meet. Because I know people who are interested in things like we've got to contextualize the gospel, we've got to find symbols, stories, rituals within the resident worldview that we can translate the gospel. We've got to contextualize things, and how can we contextualize it if culture and gospel are so far away? So am I reading you right, or in what you're saying here? So could you unpack that for us and think of a potential missional theologian who loves the concept of contextualization? I mean, what would you say to their type of objections?
I'd say, I think that, again, Augustine is just a wonderful paradigm of this, and he's both inside and outside the culture. He's an insider in the sense that he knows his Cicero, and he appreciates Cicero. He teaches Roman rhetoric in Carthage and then in Rome. He knows this system from the inside. He's not just sort of read a crib sheet on Rome in order to take it down. He knows how and why it sparkles to those inside it, and he can appreciate it and articulate that really, really well. So, he's an insider to the culture. He's not just rubbishing everything to do with Rome. But it's also really clear in the City of God that he's just a fundamental outsider to this culture. He can't, and there are some hilarious moments in the City of God where he can't take Roman culture seriously. So there's this beautiful passage where he talks about the number of gods it takes to guard a Roman threshold. And there's one for the hinges, and there's one for the door, and then there's one for the threshold himself. And you just imagine him, standing with his mouth on the floor saying, seriously, 3 gods to guard a door. Like, it takes one doorman to guard a door. Why on earth would you need 3 different gods to do this? And so he's always looking at Roman culture with an outsider's eye and sort of tittering behind his hand slightly at the absurdities of it. And I think that allows him to be a brilliant cultural critic, because the fact that he's an insider means that he takes it seriously. He's not mocking Roman culture merely. He's not just trying to take it down. He knows where it's strong, where those who love it, why they love it. But he can also see it with that slightly off-kilter glance of someone who's not just breathing that air, because he's so steeped in the Bible, and that gives him, an off-center view of it. And so I would say, for contextualization, you need both. You need the outsider's view. Otherwise, you're just going to reproduce the culture. You're going to be a mirror to the culture, and that's not going to help anyone. And the Bible, should knock everybody around at some point. It should be uncomfortable to every culture at some point. And if you're just, and I think this is what I might have been getting at with that passage you quote, if you just speak about what the Bible says in a way that never sort of challenges or brushes up against a particular culture at any point, then first of all, you've betrayed all the other cultures, because you're suggesting that the Bible is sort of culturally locked into one, cultural moment, which is just really problematic in terms of all sorts of dynamics of imperialism and privilege and that sort of thing. But you've also robbed that particular culture of the chance of seeing itself with fresh eyes or of changing at all.
Ah, that sounds like a good answer. You know that you can't just domesticate the gospel. You know, I think, was it Augustine who said, if you believe what you like in the gospel, it's not the gospel you believe, but yourself. Okay, which is, I guess that's the sort of the thing you seem to be riffing on in that regard.
Yeah, and I don't want to sort of come across as some high and mighty person who says, I'm not doing that. Everybody else is reading their own. We all do that. And part of growing in discipleship is gradually becoming aware of the points at which we're doing that, and going through the discomfort of letting the Bible rub us up the wrong way in those areas, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Chris, I want to finish off with two questions. Um, if you were, well, first of all, and this is one I didn't warn you about, this has just come to my mind. If you were teaching at a symposium where you had Foucauldian scholars, Derridan scholars, Marxist scholars, I know every type of ism and philosophy there is, and you had to come to this table, and your job was to commend the Bible to them. What would you say to them? So if you're presenting the Christian or the biblical view, if you've got the symposium of philosophers representing the various isms and the various critical theories of X, Y, and Z, what would you say to them?
It's a difficult question to answer in the abstract, isn't it? It's like the question, someone comes to you and say, how would you deal with the problem of suffering? Well, it depends precisely who's asking. I think if you wanted to come at it from a sort of a theoretical perspective, and if you wanted to sort of build a bridge between the concerns that you would imagine that particular congregation to have and the Bible, you could do something like this. You start by saying, at the end of Theodore Adorno's book, Minima Moralia, he has this concept that he says is necessary for critique. And he calls it the standpoint of redemption. And he says, you've got to find a place to stand outside the status quo in order to be able to critique the status quo. It's sort of what I was just talking about now. Augustine's an insider and an outsider. And if you don't have that standpoint of redemption, you've got no way of saying that the way things are now is not the way that they should be. Because if the way things are now is the way they've always been, the way they will always be, well, then there's just what there is. Why on earth would you say that that's not normative? And Adorno realizes this, and he calls it the standpoint of redemption. And that's really interesting, because he's sort of putting his finger on the way in which the whole idea of cultural critique in the Western tradition is a theological category. And at that point, how dare you, say that's ridiculous. It's an Enlightenment category. And I would say, well, think about what is the first moment in the Western tradition where a culture, as we understand that term today, as a whole, is critiqued. So not a particular idea or a particular movement, or even a particular philosophy, but a whole culture. I think you struggle to find anything earlier than Augustine's City of God. And I'm getting this argument from an Augustine scholar called Charles Matthews, who says that it's the first full-orbed cultural critique of the whole of a society, because Augustine does the religion and the sort of civic life and so forth. And I would say that the whole idea of critique can be traced back to this Christian source. And of course, you can go back further to the Old Testament prophets and so forth. And I would say the idea of a standpoint of redemption is crucial and important, because we all know that the way that society is now isn't the way that it should be. And we'll differ about precisely how we think it's going on, but no one thinks this is paradise on earth. And I would want to bring the Bible to the table and say, I think that the Bible provides a particularly robust and nuanced and incisive standpoint of redemption, from which one can say with with an authority that is not one's own, which I think is also important for different reasons, but I realize this answer is getting quite long, so I won't go into them. It allows you to say, the way things are now is not right, and allows you to cast a vision for a better society. And then I'd see what the people around the table said about it.
Oh, sounds like a fairly good answer like that. There's a standpoint of redemption, of dealing with the broken nature of the world and trying to find a way to make a better world. But you need something from the outside. You've got to find something from the outside. Okay, well, last question.
So. If you want, sorry, Mike, just to gloss out very, very quickly. If you want your critique to have teeth, if you want to say the way things should be is not just an idea inside my head, but it actually should have purchase more broadly, I think this is something that's valid outside my own desires and passions. That's the key.
Okay, sounds good. Well, last question, Chris. What would someone benefit from reading this book? Because this is a big book, and it's a wonderful mix of philosophy, theology, biblical studies. That's what I've enjoyed about it. So you obviously have a pretty good grasp of your French European philosophers. You're certainly into that, and the Germans and the Frankfurt School. But you've got Augustine there. You've got some biblical studies. You've got everything from Charles Taylor, Jamie Smith, Cornelius, you got Van Til, Plantinga. I mean, it really is. My gut feeling reading this is almost like an introduction to Christian philosophy, in a kind of Augustinian sense. I thought, this is good. I really appreciated the breadth of the sort of dialogue partners, and that includes from the pastoral John Stott all the way through to very highbrow, systematic theologians like Sarah Coakley and others, and a whole bunch of philosophy people I've never heard of. So I did find this, I've got a reasonable breadth of reading in my own world, but I really did find this a very illuminating, and I was impressed by the breadth of people you're kind of incorporating together. So what's the main thing you think readers will take away from the book, or what's the main benefit you want them to get out of reading your book?
I would love Christian readers to have a renewed sense of just how endlessly rich the Bible is in responding to the sort of contemporary issues and problems and questions that we face today. And that in order to develop an incisive cultural critique, you don't need to sort of take distance from the Bible and start throwing around either theological or philosophical categories at the expense of the biblical text. I'd love people to go away thinking, I need to press into the Bible if I want to do incisive and fresh and interesting cultural critique. That would be wonderful. I'd love people to feel that there's more to being a Christian in contemporary culture than to putting out fires and being on the back foot all the time. It can feel a little bit like you're besieged as a Christian sometimes. That you're just sort of being attacked from both sides, and you're just trying to fend off those attacks. And I'd love people to go away thinking, well, there's a really positive vision that Christians have to offer of society, and it's different to what other people are saying, and it's constructive and it's critical, and it's sort of on the front foot, I suppose, rather than always being on the back foot. And I suppose I'd love some people, perhaps people in academia, undergrads, graduates, people doing PhDs, fellow scholars. I'd love some people to think, well, that's all very well, but I think I could do a better job than that. And take on this sort of Augustinian shape of thinking and try and write books that I could never write, from perspectives and with expertise that I could never write. So I think there's so much to say, and I'm just aware of how little of it I can say with my own disciplinary expertise, and how much, Christians who are, sort of writing academic books about economics or even social theory or other arts and humanities disciplines can weigh in areas where I haven't had the foggiest thing not to say, and can produce this sort of Augustinian style critique in those areas. And I'd love some people to think, yeah, that was all right, but I reckon I could do better.
Okay, so you really want to inspire your own protege to supplant you.
Oh, look, not protege, people who can like eclipse me.
Your eclipse.
I'd have no pretensions of sort of, being the leader of anything. I'd love the book to be, within a decade or so. Oh yeah, there was that book, but then these other wonderful ones came
Okay.
along.
So this is more like you're John the Baptist, and it's like I must decrease and he must increase, and the increase is whoever's coming next. So okay, fair enough. That's what scholarship is. You're just sticking one brick in the wall and hoping someone else comes along and sticks the next one in, and then all together
Yeah.
we build the city of God together. I guess. I don't know.
Right, what a beautiful.
I don't know what Augustine would agree with that analogy, but I mean, you get the point. You get the point. Well, okay. Well, the book is a biblical critical theory published by Zondervan, forward by Tim Keller, and Tim Keller was very excited in this book. Tim Keller does not throw around his endorsements and forwards lightly, and Tim Keller really thinks highly of this book. So if you trust Tim Keller's judgment, I think you will definitely like this book, and I certainly commend it as well. I think it's a good sort of, my view of what an introduction to Christian philosophy is, or you could call it Augustinian biblical theory, or Augustinian critical theory. So that's a good way to appreciate it. Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. All the best to you and your endeavors for the future, and we'll see what happens and who can outdo you in your own version of biblical critical theory sometime to come.
It's been a great joy, Matt. Thank you so much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it.